Chapter 3: Medication into Submission. As we have already seen in the preceding chapters, it is not only the political and the Pavlovian pressure that may drag down a man's mind into servile submissiveness. There are many other human habits and actions which are coercive influence. All kinds of rumors have been circulated telling how brainwashes, before surrendering to their inquisitors, have been poisoned with mysterious drugs. This chapter aims to describe what medical techniques, not only drugs, can do to reach behind man's inner secrets. Actually, the thought control police no longer need drugs, though occasionally they have been used. I will touch upon another side of this problem as well, namely, our dangerous social dependency on various drugs, the problem of addiction, making it easier for us to slip into pattern of submissiveness. The alcoholic has no mental backbone anymore when you give him his drink. The same is true for the chronic use of sedative or other pills. The use of alcohol or drugs may result in chemical dependency, weakening our stamina under exceptional circumstances. In the field of practical medicine, magical thinking is still rampant. Though we flatter ourselves that we are rational and logical in our choice of therapy, somewhere we know that children's feelings and unconscious motivations direct the prescribing hand. In spite of the therapeutic triumphs of the last 50 years, the era of chemotherapy and antibiotics, let us not forget that the same means of medical victory can be used to defeat our purpose. No day passes that the male does not flood the doctor's office with suggestions about what to use in his clinical practice. My desk overflows with gadgets and multicolored pills telling me that without them, mankind cannot be happy. The propaganda campaign reaching our medical eyes and ears is often so laden with suggestions that we can be persuaded to distribute sedatives and stimulants, where straight critical thinking would deter us and we will seek the deeper cause of difficulties. This is true not only for the modern pharmacology, the same tendencies can also be shown in psychotherapeutic methods. This chapter aims to approach the problem of mental coercion with the question: how compulsive can the use of medical drugs and medical psychology methods become? In the former chapters of Menticide, I was able to describe political attempts to bring human mind into submission and severity. Drugs and their psychological equivalents are also able to enslave people. Dependency on drugs provider. Not long ago, I was asked to give advice to a couple who had marital difficulties for a long time. Although at the time of their marriage, the husband and wife were deeply in love, each had brought on to their adventure of happiness and wrong emotional investment. She had expected him to be the kind of Hollywood hero, an eternal gallant, dedicated completely to her. He had been touched by her childlike dependency, but secretly he had hoped she would be the mother, nurse, and companion to him. As might have been predicted, neither partner lived up to the other's expectations. Both were bitterly disappointed, and neither realized what was wrong. After a while, the wife became a whining, complaining nag. There were daily scenes, arguments, and reclamations. The husband began to seek solace away from home with women he had known before his marriage. Soon thereafter, the wife found herself unable to sleep and started to take barbiturates to bring herself to the soothing forgetfulness of slumber. She became completely dependent on them and treated into all kinds of vague bodily complaints which could be relieved temporarily by more drugs. When the husband first discovered this, he was appalled, but gradually he noticed that the drugs seemed to modify the ease and the discord in their relationship. Under almost constant sedation, his wife was no longer a shrew. Indeed, she was no longer even interested in him. He discovered that he had much more freedom and could spend his evenings and holidays as he chose, as long as he provided her with 4 of those magical pills that had restored peace to their home. But one night the wife took an overdose of the barbiturates, and it looked almost as if she had attempted suicide. This nearly fatal occurrence aroused all the husband's guilt feelings, and he sought medical and psychological help in an effort to discover what had gone wrong in the marriage of the two people who had felt so much initial love and goodwill. This is only one of the many cases in which the sleeping pill and drug habit covers up deep-seated, unspoken unhappiness. The growing dependency on easy escape into a soft and mild-appearing sedation and oblivion is an evil we must recognize. The general increase in the use of sleeping pill is alarming, and the number of suicide resulting from barbiturates is growing every year. Nor can we look at such a phenomena as simply as medical problem. Dependency on alcohol, barbiturates, drugs, or other soporific indicates latent and overt social fear and anxiety, and the need to escape from reality. Drugs seem to have their user to the miracle tablets, which provide a passive and magical solution to all problems and bring them to a point beyond the boundaries of the real world. The leader of the gang, who is able to provide such drugs for his members, is sure of their severity. The search for ecstasy through drugs. Among drug addicts of all sorts, we repeatedly encounter the yearning of the special ecstatic and euphoric mood, a feeling of living beyond everyday troubles. Thou hast the keys of paradise. O just, subtle and mighty opium. Thomas De Quincey says in his Confession of the English Opium Eater, although the ecstatic state is different for each person who experiences it, the addict always tells us that the drug takes him to the lost paradise he is looking for. It brings him to a feeling of eternal euphoria and free elation that takes him past the restrictions of life and time. In the ecstatic state, man rearranges the universe according to his own desire, and at the same time seeks communion with the higher order of things. But the ecstatic state has its negative as well as its positive aspect. It may represent the yogi's mystical feelings of unity with the universe, but it may also mean the chronic intoxicated state of the drunkard or the passion of some maniac psychotic state. The feeling may express the intensified spiritual experience of a dedicated study group, but on the other hand, it may be encountered in the rich mob and the riot. There are many kinds of ecstasy: aesthetic ecstasy, mystic ecstasy, and sick toxic ecstasy. The search of ecstatic experience is not only an individual search, it often reaches out to encompass whole groups. When moral controls become too burdensome, whole civilization can give themselves into uncontrollable orgies, such as we saw in the Greek Bacchalia and the contagious dance fury of the Middle Ages. In those mass orgies, artificial stimulants are not necessarily used. The hypnotic influence of being part of the crowd can induce the same loss of control and sense of union with the outside world that they associate with drugs. In the mass orgy, the individual loses his consciousness and self-control. His sexual inhibitions may disappear. He is temporarily relieved of his deeper frustration and the burden of unconscious guilt. He endeavors to re-experience the blissful sensations of infancy, the utter yielding to his own body needs and desire. The ecstatic participation in mass elation is the oldest psychodrama in the world. Taking part in some common actions result in a tremendous emotional relief and catharsis of every individual in the group. This feeling of participation in the magical omnipotent group, of reunion and communion with the all-embracing forces in the world brings euphoria to the normal person and feelings of pseudo-strength to the weak. The demagogue who is able to provide such ecstatic release in the masses can be sure of their yielding in the influence and power. Dictators love to recognize such mass rituals in service in their dictatorial aims. Ever since man has been a conscious being, he has tried from time to time to break down the inevitable tension between himself and the outside world. When mental alertness cannot be relaxed now and then, when the world is too much and not too constantly with him, Man may try to lose himself in deep waters of oblivion. Ecstasy, drugged sleep, and its fantasies and swoons of mental exhalation temporarily take him beyond the burdensome effort of keeping sense and ego alert and intact. Drugs can bring him to this state, and any dedication may be explained as continuing need to escape. The body cooperates with the victim in search for the evasion of life. The drugs gradually become a body need as well as an emotional necessity. In criminal circles, addicting drugs like cocaine or heroin are often given to members of the gang in order to make them more submissive to the leader who distributes them. The man who provides the drugs becomes almost a god to the members of the gang. They will go through hell for him in order to acquire the drug they so desperately need. In the hands of the powerful tyrant, this medication into dependency can become extremely dangerous. It is not unthinkable that a diabolical dictator might want to use addiction as means of bringing rebellious people into submission. In May of 1954, during a discussion in the World Health Organization, the fact was disclosed that Communist China, while forbidding the use of opium in her own country, was smuggling and exporting in great quantities to her neighbors, who had consequently been compelled to carry on a constant struggle against opium addiction among their own people and against the passivity which results from use of the drug. At the same time, according to officials of Thailand who made the charge and who requested UN aid, Communist China has been sending all kinds of subversive propagandists into Thailand. Thailand charged that the Chinese were using every device they know to infect the Siamese people with their ideology, brain-weakening opium addiction, leaflets, radio, whispering campaigns, and so on. The Nazis followed a similar strategy. During the occupation of the Western Europe, they created an artificial shortage of normal medicaments by halting their usual export of healing drugs to the inferior countries. However, they made it an exception in the case of barbiturates. In Holland, for example, these drugs were made readily available in many drugstores without doctors' prescriptions, a situation which was against the customary Dutch law. Although the right therapeutic drugs were not made available for medical work, the drugs which created passivity, dependency, and lethargy were widely distributed. The totalitarian dictator knows that drugs can be his helpers. It was Hitler's intention, in his so-called biological warfare, to weaken and subdue the countries that surrounded the Third Reich and to break their backbones for good. Hunger and addiction were among his most valuable strategic tools. What has all this to do with the growing addiction and alcoholism in our own country? I have already mentioned the alarming increase in death from barbiturates, but I would like to emphasize even more the psychology and the political consequence. Democracy and freedom end where slavery and submission to drugs and alcohol begin. Democracy involves free, self-chosen activity and understanding. It means mature self-control and independence. Any man who escapes from reality through the use of alcohol and drugs is no longer a free agent. He is no longer able to accept any voluntary control over his mind and his actions. He is no longer a self-responsible individual. Alcoholism and drug addiction prepare a pattern for mental submission to be loved by the totalitarian brainwasher. Hypnotism and mental coercion. From time immemorial, those who wanted to know the inner workings of other fellow humans' mind in order to exert pressure on him have used artificial means to find the hidden pathways to his most private thoughts. Modern brainwashers too have tried all kinds of drugs to arrive at their devious objectives. The primitive medicine man had several methods of compelling his victim to lose his self-control and reserve. Alcoholic drinks, toxic ointments, or permeating holy smoke, which had a narcotizing effect, are used by the Mayas, for example, were used to bring people into such a state of rapture that they lost their self-awareness and restraint. The victims' murmuring scared words often revealed their self-accusing fantasies or even their deepest secrets. In the Middle Ages, so-called witch ointments were used either voluntarily or under pressure. These ointments were supposed to bring the anointed one into touch with the devil. Since they contained opiates and belladonna in large quantities, which could have been absorbed by the skin, modern science can explain the ecstatic visions they evoke in the typical hallucination-provoking effect of these drugs. One of the first useful technique medicine delivered into the hands of the prior into souls was the knowledge of hypnosis. That intensified mental suggestion that makes people give up their own will and bring them into strange dependency of the hypnotizer. The Egyptian doctors of 3,000 years ago knew the technique of hypnosis, and ancient records tell us that they practiced it. In the hands of an honest therapist, hypnosis can be extremely useful, particularly in dealing with psychosomatic diseases and physical pain. That bastard son of fantasy and reality, hypnosis, is the Good Samaritan. But there are many quacks who practice hypnosis not to cure their victims but to force them into submission, using the victim's unconscious ties and dependency needs in a criminal, profitable way. There are unconscious sexual roots in hypnosis related to the passive feeling of the attacker, which the quack used to give vent to his own passion. I once treated a girl after he had gone to such a healer. It was only at the very moment that she had been able to get out of her lethargic, submissive state and fight off his assault. Not long ago, I treated some teenagers who had tried to hypnotize each other. They wanted to learn the intricacies of technique in order to increase their mental power over other people. Inspired by some comic book stories, they imagined that through the use of hypnosis, they can influence girls to yield to their sexual advances. They expected to become a Superman who could make the other people instruments of the satisfaction of their own lust and will. One of the most absorbing aspects of this whole problem of hypnosis is the question of whether people can be forced to commit crimes, such as murder or treason, while under the hypnotic spell. Many psychologists will deny that such a thing could happen and would insist that no person can be compelled to do under hypnosis what he would refuse to do in a state of alert consciousness. But actually, what a person can be compelled to do depends on the degree of dependency that hypnosis causes and the frequency of repetition of the so-called post-hypnotic suggestions. Actually, psychoanalysis teaches that there even exist several other devices to live other people's lives. True, no hypnotizer can take away a man's conscience and inner resistance immediately, but he can arouse later murderous wishes which may become active in the victim's unconscious by continuous suggestions and continue preying onto those deeply resented desires. Actual knowledge of methods used in brainwashing and menticides proves that all this can be done. If the hypnotizer persists long enough and cleverly enough, he can be successful in his aim. There are many antisocial desires lying hidden in all people. The hypnotic technique, if cleverly enough applied, can bring them to the surface and cause them to react out in life. The mass criminality of the guards in concentration camps finds part in this explanation in the hypnotizing influence of the authoritarian state and his criminal dictator. Psychological study of criminals show that their first violation of moral and legal codes often takes place under the strong influence and suggestions of other criminals. This we may look upon as initial form of hypnosis, which is a more intensified form of suggestions. True, The incitement to crime in a hypnotic state demands specially favorable condition, but unfortunately, this condition can be found in real and actual world. Recently, there has been much judicial discussion in the problem of psychiatric who uses his special knowledge of suggestion to force confession from a dependent. Such a psychiatrist is going beyond the commonly accepted concepts of a limitation of psychiatry and beyond psychiatric ethics. He is misusing the patient's trust in the medical confidant and therapist in order to provoke a confession which will then be used against the patient temporarily in his care. In so doing, the doctor not only acts against his Hippocratic oath in which he promised only to work for the good of his patients and never to disclose their professional secrets, he also violates the constitutional safeguarded to a defendant by the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which protects a man against self-incrimination. What a defendant will reveal under hypnosis depends on his conscious and unconscious attitudes towards the entire question of magical influence and mental intrusion by another person. People are usually less likely to stand to their legal rights in dealing with a doctor than in dealing with a lawyer or a policeman. They have a yielding attitude because they expect magic help. An interesting example of this can be seen in the case that we recently decided by the Supreme Court. In 1950, Camilo Weston Rea, a man in his 50s, was arrested and accused by the police of the brutal hammer murder of his aged parents in their Brooklyn flat. At first, under prolonged questioning by the police, Rayla denied any knowledge of the crime and stated that he had not even been in his parents' home on the day of the murder. Later, after further interrogation by the police, he said he had been in their home that day, but he remained firm in his denial of the murder. He was detained in jail and a psychiatrist was brought to talk to him. Their conversation was recorded on tape. The psychiatrist told Rayla that he was his doctor, although in fact he was not. Under slight hypnosis and after continuous suggestions that Rayla would be better if he admitted to having committed the murder in fit of passion, Rayla agreed to confess to the crime. The police were called back in and the confession was taken down. During his trial, Rayla repeated the confession, insisting that he had been under hypnosis. He was convicted, but the conviction was set aside on the grounds that the confession had been wrested from him involuntarily, and that his constitutional safeguard had been denied him. Later, Rayla was brought to trial and convicted a second time. Finally, his case was appealed to the Supreme Court, which reversed the conviction in June 1954 on the grounds that mental pressure and coercive psychiatric techniques had been used to induce the confession. The Supreme Court gave its opinion here, indirectly, on the responsibility of the brainwashed prisoners of war. For us, the question of Rayla's guilt or innocence is of less importance than the fact that under mental pressure he was induced to do what he would ordinarily have resisted doing, and that his confidence in the doctor, which led him to relax the defenses he would doubtless have put up against other investigators, was used to break him down. Suggestions and hypnosis can be a psychological blessing, through which patients can solve emotional problems that resist conscious will, but they can also be the beginning of terror. Mass hypnosis, for example, can have a dangerous influence on the individual. Psychiatrists have found several times that public demonstration of mass hypnosis may provoke an increased hypnotic dependency and submissiveness in many members of the audience that can last for years. Largely for this reason, Great Britain has passed a law making seance and mass hypnosis illegal. Hypnosis may act as a trigger mechanism for a repressed infantile dependency need in the victim and turn into a kind of waking sleepwalker and mental slave. The hypnotic command relieves him of his personal responsibility and he surrenders much of his concerns to his hypnotizer. As we mentioned before, our own times have provided us with far too many examples of how political hypnosis, mob hypnosis, and even war hypnosis can turn civilized men into criminals. Some personalities are more amenable to hypnosis than others. Strong egos can defend themselves for a long time against mental intrusion, but they too may have a point of surrender. There are overtly critical persons who are much less sensitive to suggestions from the outside than to images from within themselves. We can distinguish between heterosuggestive and autosuggestive personalities, although quite a variety of reactions to hypnosis and suggestion could be distinguished. But even those autosuggestive types, if subjected to enough pressure, will gradually build up internal justification for giving in the mental coercion. Those charming characters who are easily able to influence others are often extremely susceptible to suggestions themselves. Some personalities with a tremendous gift of empathy and identification provoke in others the desire to yield up all their secrets. They seem somehow to be the father confessor by the grace of God. Other emphatic types, by reflecting their own deceiving inner world, can more easily provoke the hidden lies and fantasies in their victims. Still others make us close up completely. Why one man should inspire the desired relationship and contact? Why do certain personalities complement and reinforce one another while others crush and destroy one another? Psychoanalysis has given new insights into those strange human relationships and involvements. Needling for the truth. During the Second World War, the technique of the so-called self-truth serum, the popular name of the necroanalysis, was developed to help soldiers who had broken down under the strain of struggle. Through necroanalysis by means of a junction of sedatives, they could be brought to remember and reveal the hyper-emotional and traumatic moments of their war experiences that had driven them into acute anxiety neurosis. Gradually, a useful mental first aid technique was developed, which helped the unconscious to relieve its secret while the patient was Gradually, a useful mental first aid technique was developed, which helped the unconscious to reveal its secret while the patient was under the influence of the narcotic. How does the truth serum work? The principle is simple. After an injection, the mind is a kind of half asleep and unable to control its secret, and may let them slip through the hidden reservoirs of frustration and repression into the half-conscious mind. In certain acute anxiety cases, such enforced provocation may alleviate the anxieties and pressure that have led to breakdown. But narcoanalysis often does not. Sometimes the patient's mind resents this chemical intrusion and enforced intervention, and such a situation often obstructs the way for deeper and more useful psychotherapy. The fear of unexpected mental intrusion and coercion may be pathological in character. When I first published my concept of menticide and brainwashing, I received dozens of letters and phone calls from people who were convinced that some outside person was trying to influence them and direct their thoughts. This form of mental intrusion delusion may be early stage of serious psychosis in which the victim has already regressed to primitive magic feelings. In this state, the whole outside world is seen and felt as participating in what is going on in the victim's mind. There is, as it were, no real awareness of the frontiers between I, the person, and the world. Such a fear-ridden person are in constant agony because they feel themselves the victims of many mysterious influences which they cannot check or cope with. They feel continually endangered. Psychologically, Their fear of intrusion from the outside can partially be experienced as a fear of intrusion of their own fantasies from the inside, from the unconscious. They act frightened of their own hidden unconscious thoughts which they can no longer check. I would be a vast of a simplification to stick an It will be a vast oversimplification to stick an easy psychiatric label on all such feelings and mental persecutions, for there are many real outside mental pressures in our world, and there are many perfectly normal people who are continually aware of this, disturbed by the barrage of stimuli directed in their minds through propaganda, advertising, radio, television, and movies and newspaper. All the gibbering maniacs whose voices never stop. Those people suffer because a cold, mechanical, shouting world is knocking continually in doors of their minds and disturbing them with feelings of privacy and personal integrity. There is the future question of whether or not that drugs used in truth serum will always produce the desired effect of compelling the patient to tell the inner truth. For experiments conducted at Yale University in 1951, J. McDonald, one of the persons who received intravascular injection of sodium amytil, the so-called truth serum, showed interesting results tending to weaken our faith in this drug. Each of the patients prior to the injection had been suggested a false story related to a historic period about which he was going to be questioned. The experiment knew both the true and false story. Let me quote from the report. It is of interest that these 3 subjects diagnosed as normal maintained their suggested stories. Of the 6 subjects diagnosed as neurotic, 2 promptly revealed the true story. 2 had made partial admissions consisting of complex pattern of fantasy and truth. 1 communicated what would most likely was a fantasy as truth, and the one obsessive-compulsive individual maintained his cover story except for the paraxia, full of branded in action. In several cases, American locals have refused to admit as evidence the results of truth serum test, largely on the basis of psychiatric conviction that the truth serum treatment is misnamed, that in fact the narco-analysis is no guarantee of getting out to the truth. It may even be used to coercive threat in cases where victims are not aware of its limited actions. Still another danger, more closely related to a subject, is what a criminal investigator can induce in the communicate his own thoughts and feelings to his victim. Thus, the truth serum may cause the patient with weak ego to yield to interventionist synthetically injected through the interpretation in exactly the same way the victim of hypnosis may take over the suggestions implanted by the hypnotist. Additionally, this method of inquisition by drugs contains some physical danger. I myself have seen cases of thrombosis develop as a result of intravenous medication of barbiturates. Experiment with mescaline, which started 30 years ago, are suddenly fashionable again. Aldous Huxley, in his recent book, The Dose of Perception, described the artificial chemical paradise which he experienced after taking the drug. It can stimulate all kinds of pressure, subjective symptoms, but these are, nevertheless, delusive in character. I do not want to start a clinical argument with an author I esteem, yet his own euphoric, ecstatic reaction to mescaline and are not necessarily the same as those people experience. 25 years ago, I myself experiment with mescaline in order to make a first-hand acquaintance with genuine pathological thoughts. I nearly collapsed as a result. Only a few people have had the ecstatic experience. Huxley described, mescaline is dangerous stuff when not used under medical control, and anyway, why does the Huxley want to sell artificial heavens? There is a very serious social danger in all these methods of chemical intrusion into the mind. True, They can be used as carefree aid of psychotherapy, but they can also be frightening instrument of control in the hands of men with an overwhelming drive to power. In addition, they fortify more than ever in our aspiring age the fiction that we have to use miracle drugs in order to become free acting agents. The propaganda of the chemical elation for artificial ecstasy and pseudo-nevic experience contains an intervention to men to become chemical students, and chemical dependents are weak people who can be made to use by any tyrannical power potentate. The actual propaganda carried on among general practitioners arguing treatment of all kinds of anxieties and mental disturbances with new drugs has the same kind of dangerous implications. The lie detector. Hypnosis and narcoanalysis are only two of the current devices that can be used as instruments of enforced intrusion into the mind. The lie detector, which had already been used as a tool of mental intimidation, is another. This apparatus, useful for the psychobiological experimentation, can indicate, through writing down meticulously the changes in the psychogalvanic reflex, that the human guinea pig under investigation reacts more emotionally to certain questions than to others. True, this overreaction may be the reaction of having told a lie, but it may also be an innocent person's reaction to an emotional-laden situation or even to an increased fear of unjust accusation. The interpersonal process between interrogator and testee have just as much influence on the process, on the emotional reactions and the changes in the galvanic reflexes as feelings of inner guilt and confusion. This experiment only indicates inner turmoil and hidden repression, with all their doubts and ambiguities. It is not in fact a lie detector, although it is used and such. As a matter of fact, the pathological liar and the psychopathic conscienceless personality may also show less a reaction to this experiment than do normal people. The lie detector is more likely to become a tool coercive in the hands of men who look more for the powerful magic in every instrument than means of getting at the truth. As a result, even the innocent can be fooled into false confession. The therapy as an instrument of coercion. Medical therapy and psychotherapy are subtle sciences of human guidance in periods of physical and emotional stress. Just as training requires the alert, well-planned participation of both students and teacher, some successful psychotherapy requires the alert, well-planned participation of both patient and doctor. And just as educational training under special conditions can degenerate into a coercive taming, so therapy can degenerate into an imposition of the doctor will to his patients. The doctor himself need to even be conscious that this is happening. This misuse of therapy may also itself in the patient's submission to the doctor's point of view or in the patient's development of excessive dependency on his therapist. Such a dependency and even increased dependency need may extend not only far beyond their usual limits, but may continue even after the therapy has run its course. I have seen quacks whose only knowledge was when to buy their coaches. By calling themselves psychoanalysts, they were able to gratify their own need, live other people's lives. Eventually, the role will have to establish standards which can keep these dangerous intruders from psychotherapeutic practice. But even the most conscious therapist has a serious moral problem to face. His profession itself continually encourages him, indeed obliges him, to make his patients temporarily dependent on him, and this may appeal to his own needs for a sense of importance and power. He must be continually aware of the fact his statements and deductions have on his parents, who often listen in awe to the doctor who is for them an omniscient magician. The therapist must not encourage this submissive attitude in his parents. Though in some phases of treatment will help, it will help the therapy. For good psychotherapy aims towards educating man to freedom and maturity, not for conforming submission. The practitioners of psychology and psychiatrists are now much more aware of the responsibility their profession imposes on them than they have been thereafter. The tools of psychology are dangerous in hands of the wrong people. Modern education methods can be applied in therapy to streamline man's brain and change his opinions so that his thinking converges with certain ideological systems. Medicine and psychiatry may become more and more involved in political strategy, as we have seen in the strategy of brainwashing, and for this reason, psychologists and psychiatrists must become more aware of the future of the scientific tools used. The emphasis on the therapeutic techniques on students knowing all the facts and the tricks, the overemphasis of psychotherapy diplomas and labels led actual therapy toward conformism and rationalization of the principles that are in contrast to the personal sensitivity needed. On critical and rational faculty can be a destructive one. Consulting or discussing our basic doubts and ambivalences were born of magic despair. The creator of human sensitivity, the danger of modern psychotherapy, is the tendency towards formalizing. The danger of modern psychotherapy and psychology is the tendency towards formalizing human intuition and empathy, and toward making an abstraction and emotion spontaneity. It is a contradiction to attempt to machinize love and beauty. If it were possible, we would find ourselves in a world where there is no inspiration and ecstasy, but only cold understanding. Every human relationship can be used for the wrong or the right aims, and this is especially true to the relationship or subtle unconscious ties which exist between psychotherapists and patients. This statement is equally true for medicine in general. The surgeon, too, thrives on strong ties with his patients and their willing submission to this surgical technique. Freud gave us the first clear explanation of what happens in the minds during the prolonged mental contact with human beings. He showed that in every intensive human relationship, and participant reacts at least partially in terms of expectation and illusion he developed in his own childhood. As a result of prolonged therapy, based on the principle of utter freedom and expression, provides as much opportunity for transference of private feelings for the doctor as for the patient. If the doctor is not careful, if he does not understand this mutual transfer of hidden emotion, or if in his compulsive zest to explain everything, he is too coercive and may force the patient into acceptance of this point of view, instead of helping the patient to arrive at his own. This can become mental intrusion or a dangerous kind. Experience in therapy have taught us that faculty techniques can give the patient feeling of being bogged down. Sometimes patients feel as if they have to remain living in servile submission to the doctor. I have seen whole families and secrets swear by word of modern witch doctor. No wonder that sound psychoanalytic instruction requires a therapist to submit himself to years of technique he is about to apply to others, so that armed with knowledge of his own unsound unconscious needs, he will not only use his profession to mastermind other people's lives. Various psychological agencies, with their different psychological concepts and techniques, such as family counseling, religious guidance, management counseling, and so forth, can easily be misused as tools of power. The goodwill that people invest in their leaders, doctors, and administrators is tremendous and can be used as a weapon against them. Even modern brain surgery for healing the mind can be misused by modern dictators to make zombies out of their competitors. Psychology itself may lead to standardize the mind, and the tendency among different schools of psychology to emphasize authoritarian increase outwardly to mental coercion. If you don't talk my magic Gobi book, I have to condition it to you. It is easier to manipulate the minds of others than to avoid doing so. A democratic society gives its citizens the right to act for freedom of rights. At the same time, it imposes on them the responsibility of maintaining their freedom, mental as well as political. If through the use of the modern facial, chemical, and medical techniques of mental coercion, we reduce man's capacity to act on his own initiative, we subvert our own beliefs and weakening our democratic systems. Just as there is a deliberate political brainwashing, so can there be a sensitive intrusion masquerading under the name of justice and therapy. This way, this may be less obstructive than the deliberate totalitarian attack, but it is not less dangerous. Medication into submission is an existing fact. Man can use this knowledge of the mind on a fellow man being not to help me, but to hurt him and bog him down. The magician can increase his power by increasing the anxieties and fears of his victim, by exploring his tendency needs, and by provoking his feelings of guilt and inferiority. Drugs and medical techniques can be used to make man a submissive and conforming being. This we can have to keep in mind in order to be able to make him really healthy and free.